Okay, calm down.
It's interesting what you said. I've heard a lot of people say this that, they used to support Israel and now they don't. But how much of what Israel's doing now is a departure from the way they used to be versus how much is it that we just see it on social media? I mean, because Israel was founded, right, through even Benny Morris admits he doesn't use the word, but ethnic cleansing or transfer, as he admits, as he calls it. How much has Israel changed versus how much we've just seen it for what it is.
I understand what you're saying, and I agree with you in good part, but not completely. There's no question that from the beginning, the Zionists who came to Palestine understood that there was going to have to be massive ethnic cleansing for purposes of creating a Jewish state. There's no way that Zionists coming out of Europe and landing in Palestine, where there is a large population of Palestinians, can create a Jewish state without doing significant ethnic cleansing. And of course, they cleansed or transferred. Transfer was the word back then. They transferred about 750,000 Palestinians in 1948, many of whom, by the way, went to Gaza. And
Right.
many of these people fighting today are descendants of those people who were pushed out in 1948. And then the second big cleansing was mainly in the West Bank after the 1967 war. And there's no question that what the Israelis did, especially in 48, was absolutely horrific. And there's also no question that we didn't know much about it in the West. And furthermore, the Israelis were able to purvey this story that the Arab armies, which went to war against Israel shortly after it declared its independence, this is, I believe, May 14th, 1948. The Israelis declare their independence, and Israel then ends up in a war with a number of Arab armies. And the story that we were told when I was young was that the reason the Palestinians left was not because they were cleansed, but because these Arab armies told them to leave. They were going to come in, they would kill all the Israelis or all the Zionists or all the Jews. And once they were done killing them, throwing them into the sea, the Palestinians could come back to their house or to their houses.
Right.
This story is completely false. There's no evidence to support it. The Israelis cleansed Gaza. And what's happened is we have figured all of this out with the passage of time. Just very quickly, if I can tell you sort of what I think is the series of events that changed not only my thinking, but all sorts of people's thinking
Yeah.
about Israel and undermined this Exodus story that was so firmly entrenched in people's minds a long time ago. The first big event is the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. Uh, that was heavily covered in the media. And here you see the importance of the media. This gets back to the very important point you were making, especially about social media today. But the media began to cover things in a big way in 1982 in ways that it didn't in 1948. And we saw what was happening. And it was a terrible picture. And of course, the massacres in Sabra and Shatila did enormous damage to Israel's reputation. Then in the late 1980s, the new historians came along. You mentioned Benny Morris's name, but Ilan Pappé was another prominent figure. Avi Schleim was another prominent figure. And there were a number of other people as well. And they got access to the Israeli archives. And they told the story about what really happened in 1948. They told you how Israel was created. And they not only told you what happened in 1948, they took you back to the early 20th century and told you how people like Ben Gurion thought about what was necessary to create a Jewish state in a sea of Arabs. And what's very important to understand here is that once you heard the explanation that people like Morris and people like Schleim and Pape were providing, you understood that it made perfect sense, right? You understood that the Israelis or the Zionists had to do terrible things to create a Jewish state. It was just unavoidable. So, from a logical point of view and from an empirical point of view, or from the historical record, you began to see what was really going on in terms of how Israel was created. Now, third thing you want to keep in mind is you had the first Intifada in 1987. This is the first big public uprising. Again, this is when you have a lot of news coverage. And then in the 90s, the situation began to move back in the other direction because of the Oslo peace process. But that all failed. And then you had the second Intifada. And after the second Intifada and more historical work being done on Israel, especially by Arab and Palestinian scholars, this is another very important part of the change that took place since I was a young man, if not young boy. In those days, it was basically white people who, Europeans and Americans who created the discourse about Israel. And most of those people were super friendly to Israel. They were pro Israel. That world has gone away. You now have lots of people like Rashid Halidi, right,
Yeah.
who can tell a very different story. And I want to be very clear here. It's not just Rashid Halidi, it's also the fact that you have lots of Israelis, lots of American Jews, lots of American non Jews who are telling the same story that Rashid Halidi is telling,
Yeah.
right? There are different twists on all these stories that these people tell, but the same basic story is being told. And now, today, we have alternative media. And you and I talking here is a perfect example of this. You couldn't do this in 1982. You couldn't even do it in 2000 at the time of Camp David, right? When Bill Clinton and Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat were at Camp David in late 2000 trying to negotiate a settlement. You had no alternative media. You had to depend on the New York Times and CBS and NBC. And of course, what you got was very slanted. You didn't get a critical eye looking at what was going on. Now you have, people like people like Aaron, people like Max Blumenthal, just all sorts of people, Chaz Freeman, um, me, Steve Walton, so forth and so on. We're all out there, opining on these events. And the discourse has just changed drastically. And it's very hard for Israel's defenders uh, to deceive us. And we're making it very hard for them to deceive, middle America or middle Germany or middle France, right? So uh, the whole discourse has just changed in fundamental ways, and it is not advantageous to Israel.
Although what's frustrating is that we've seen public opinion shift, but public policy has not caught up with it.
The lobby operates at two levels. When Steve and I wrote our book, this is one of the first things that we figured out. The lobby is deeply interested in controlling the discourse as much as it can, because controlling the discourse is related to public opinion, what the people in the body politic think. And that's where they've lost out in recent years. That's what we were just talking about. But they care more about the elite level,
Right.
and there they continue to be wildly successful. It's really quite remarkable. And we'll see this on display on June 24th when Benjamin Netanyahu comes to talk to Congress. I think the only interesting question is how many standing ovations will he get? And what you see is that the lobby continues to maintain tremendous influence on the legislative branch and on the executive branch, and that hasn't changed. And the interesting question moving forward, as I'm sure you recognize, is whether or not all of this change down below will have an impact up on top.
Because we were blessed with so much time with Professor Mearsheimer, some of this will be Patreon only. So to see the full stream with Professor Mearsheimer, please become Patreon supporters at patreon.com/the Katie Halper Show. Again, that's patreon.com/the Katie Halper Show. So you can hear his thoughts on Russia, Ukraine, and World War.